Beyond the Gates spoilers tease that the collapse of a marriage rarely arrives like a volcanic eruption. More often it begins as a hairline crack, invisible until a single careless step makes the whole thing crumble. Ted's fracture had been hairline for months. Small lies, late nights, the way he flinched when someone mentioned responsibility, and then, in the dim light of a bar that reeked of stale beer and second chances, Leslie found the crack and widened it with a smile. The bar was the kind of place that gave people permission to be someone else for an hour. The neon glow softened faces and made secrets look less sharp. Ted sat hunched over the counter, a man undone by his own hands. The bets and whispers that had trailed him all week, family members murmuring, friends nudging one another as though watching a slow-motion train wreck, had driven him to the counter. He wanted something to obliterate the smallness of the room he'd been living in, the low-grade humiliation of being the punchline in a family joke. He wanted, in a way he couldn't name, absolution that came in a glass. Leslie watched him from across the room. She was, by temperament, a strategist who preferred to appear like chaos. Her laughter filled a space the way a thrown stone ripples a pond. You noticed it after the shock passed. She had eyes that catalogued people, what to take and what to leave. When she saw Ted, teetering between bravado and despair, she recognized a utility. It wasn't sympathy that pulled her across the room, it was opportunity. She set a plan in motion that night as if she was assembling pieces on a board. The first part was to appear harmless, a shoulder to lean on, a confidant in a moment of weakness. The second part was to embroil him in a narrative of his own weaknesses, to offer him a version of himself that could still be admired if only for a night. Leslie never did anything by accident. Her kindness had a beginning, a middle, and an end shaped to a purpose. Ted, numbed and less exacting than usual, let it happen. People like him when they're being seen in the way they used to be, admired, needed, vital. Leslie's attention stroked an old, dangerous part of him, the part that equated worth with conquest. When she suggested he needed to get out of the bar, when she offered to take him somewhere quieter, to a room where they could be anonymous, he followed her with the kind of blind obedience that comes from thinking you have nothing left to lose. The hotel hallway smelled of carpet cleaner and aftershave, another manufactured anonymity. Ted's legs were unsteady, not just from the liquor but from the weight of self-accusation he had been carrying for years. Leslie reached out, took his arm like a director guiding an actor into a scene, and whispered something that sounded like consolation and instruction. The whisper was shaped to confuse and comfort simultaneously, just the cadence a man like Ted needed to stop analyzing and start doing. In a room that would later become the pivot point of his life, they undressed and lay side by side, and the gulf between shame and relief was erased, if only temporarily, by the heat of contact. The detail that would be pointed to in gossip naked, together. Ted clung to the moment because it felt like affirmation. Leslie claimed it because it proved that she could bend someone to her will. Morning, when it came, was another kind of revelation. Ted woke not with triumph but with nausea and the slow, relentless sinking feeling of being discovered by himself. The exhilaration of the night had been a bandage over old wounds. Daylight was surgical. Leaving the room, leaving Leslie with the smug smile of a woman who had completed a plan, Ted felt hollow. He had not found himself, he had confirmed something worse, had become someone he could not respect. He returned to a world that had been watching him in anonymous, cruel ways long before that night. Family members who had put small wagers on his demise felt vindicated by gossip. Friends traded theories like baseball cards. The speed with which the private became public would have stunned him if he still trusted surprise. He could have anticipated reproof, but the severity of Nicole's response was a blow that left him stunned. Nicole's refusal to take him back was not theatrical. She did not stand on a lawn with a sign. She sat across from him as if he were a case to be evaluated. Her hurt was precise. She had been patient and generous, maybe to a fault, but patience is not an endless resource. She had forgiven before. Forgiving everything would be a self-erasure. To Nicole, fidelity wasn't just about bodies. It was about being someone's anchor in life. Ted's infidelity was an indicator he wasn't the pillar she needed. Ted, drowning in a mixture of shame and ego, accepted the inevitability of divorce as if naming it might make the world smaller again. The admission, When it came, was both relief and finality. He knew he had burned his last bridge, but he also seemed relieved to stop pretending. He had been living a lie of competence and stability. The affair stripped the last layer of varnish. In that vacuum, he could either rebuild or accept being undone. When the family gossip turned public and the Dupree's judgment shadowed him, Ted clung to Leslie like a life preserver. He was not seeking redemption with her, he was seeking refuge from a truth too heavy to carry alone. She became a shield he could hide behind, a cause, a distraction, a confirmation that he still mattered. There is a certain cruelty in leaning on someone only to find that they are using you as much as you use them. For Leslie, his dependence was entertainment turned into currency. Nicole's words, when she finally confronted him, were surgical and cold. "You are a coward," she said, not in the fevered, accusatory tone of someone who wants to hurt an opponent, but rather in the quiet voice of someone who is settling accounts. Her accusation cut because it wasn't about a single night, it was about a pattern. Ted bristled, but inside, he knew the truth of it. Cowardice is often not dramatic, it's the small, continual abdication of responsibility. He had not just been unfaithful, he had been unwilling to be the kind of man who could be relied upon. He tried, in the stunned way of wounded pride, to ask why Bill was treated differently. Bill's own moral failings had been many and public at times, but he had always carried an air of independence. When people judged Bill, they did it as spectators to a man choosing a hard life. With Ted, the judgment had been harsher, precisely because the narrative involved dependence had been seen as leaning on others emotionally and financially in ways that undermined his masculinity in the eyes of the family. Ted's question, "Why was Bill accepted and he condemned?" was less a demand for fairness and more an attempt to pinpoint the line he had crossed. Nicole's response was a device of truth. She told him that there was an answer already inside, he only needed to listen. "Bill," she said, "was not dependent on anyone." That is where the difference lies. He may have made reckless choices, but he stood with his own hands on the steering wheel. That is different to hiding behind someone else's life. Then she asked the question that pinned him like a butterfly under glass: had he ever been a support in the way a man should be, an anchor for a family? Ted's silence was the confession. Nicely worded. The question was less a condemnation than an inquiry into his identity, something he had never been forced to examine acutely before. It's an odd thing, the way people divide fault. Bill was a known quantity, he presented his flaws openly and took the social consequences, which paradoxically made forgiveness easier. Ted's sin was different because it hinted at a more fundamental lack, a man who chose weakness over accountability. Nicole's cool ambivalence was an intensifier. She refused to let him manipulate grief into a plea for reunion. She would not be the one to paper over his absence of backbone. When Leslie learned that Nicole refused to reconcile and heard that Ted would be available for a divorce, she could hardly hide her triumph. She came to Nicole not with apology but with a provocation. Leslie wanted the satisfaction of rubbing salt into the wound, of showing that she had managed to take what Nicole had lost. She was exuberant in a way that annoyed the people around her. She had been victorious, or so she thought. The woman who had disrupted a household now wanted to display her prize. Nicole met Leslie's glee with something colder than rage, contempt that was wrapped in strategy. She told Leslie to keep Ted close. "Hold on to him," Nicole said, because she was not interested in watching him stumble and recover in the arms of another. "Let him finalize the divorce. Make it quick." The instruction was pragmatic and disarming, as if Nicole could not be roused into the melodrama Leslie craved. She added, as if testing the deeper waters, perhaps Ted was only using Leslie to provoke Nicole into action. A final gambit in a battle between two people neither of whom he could control. Leslie's smile faltered under that suggestion. The notion that she might be the instrument rather than the player lodged into her the way a splinter lodges into skin. She had not entertained the idea that Ted, capable of such weakness, might be orchestrating his own ruin as a way to watch them all scramble. The thought was for her both uncomfortable and irresistible. If Ted had been using her, her victory was Pyrrhic. Yet the alternative, a thought she was simply enjoying the chaos, was also true. Her internal reaction was a mixture of indignation and calculation. If he used her, she would find a way to use him back. She was not the kind of person who enjoyed being a pawn. Ted, left with the knowledge of being exchanged and spoken for, felt small. He tried to explain that he had been lost, that he had needed someone to notice him, that he had come to Leslie out of a fog. Words, when he formed them, sounded like excuses even to his own ears. He felt exposed not just in the tangible sense divorce papers, family judgment, but in the intangible erosion of self-respect. For someone like Ted, whose identity had been partially wrapped in being part of a unit, the unit breaking signaled a redefinition that felt more like erasure. The community's response to all of this was ruthless and efficient. People love stories where moral lines are clear, villains and victims, wins and losses. This situation offered ambiguity, which made it more appealing as entertainment. Rumors traveled faster than compassion. The wagers that had been placed against Ted had been an ugly way of predicting his fall. When those wagers were proven right, the smugness in the room proliferated. Ted's humiliation became, for some, proof that the universe still had rules and that those who violated them paid. Nicole, however, moved differently. She understood that humiliation can either break you or make you deliberate. She chose deliberate. Her strategy was not revenge as spectacle, it was reconstruction as policy. Divorce was a legal process, but for Nicole it was also a social contract severed and an opportunity to rewrite her life without a man who had refused to be her anchor. She began, in small and practical ways, to reassert boundaries: legal counsel, reorganizing shared finances, telling the people who mattered that she would not be baited. Her stoicism became a kind of armor, and as the weeks stretched on, it clarified her stance to others. This woman was not to be trifled with. Leslie, still basking in the early glow of victory, began to notice the fragility behind facade. People who win often underestimate what victory costs them. The question of whether Ted had used her or not pricked at her sense of control. If she was merely part of a game, what had she actually gained? Admiration from a man with a broken self? A reputation tarnished by association? She considered whether to escalate if she could make Nicole regret the refusal by making Ted's life publicly unbearable, or by revealing some private detail that would humiliate them all. Schemes started to roll in her head like dice. Ted, meanwhile, drifted in that post-affair fog where each small action felt like dragging a weight. He tried, at times, to blame the family for setting him up, for the cruel bets that had whispered his failing, as if the world had conspired to push him toward the worst version of himself. This blaming was a comforting myth he told himself to avoid confronting the real core of failure. Accountability, which requires humility, was harder than the self-pity he indulged in. At the center of all of this was an unspoken, aching question: what does it take for a man to be the person his partner needs? Bill's acceptance in the community had always benefited from a particular kind of narrative, one that favored the lone, scandalous figure who lived with consequence on his own terms. Ted's failure was marred by his neediness. In a family and a culture that prized stoicism masked as reliability, the difference was decisive. Nicole's indictment, had he ever been the anchor, was less a personal condemnation than a social diagnosis. There is a peculiar cruelty to being shown the space you failed to fill. Ted's response vacillated between anger and implosion. He started to withdraw from the rooms where people gathered, replacing conversation with television and quiet drinks. Leslie, who at first had been a catalyst, began to seem more and more like a mirror reflecting only his worst traits. Her presence did not redeem him; if anything, it amplified his hollowness. The consequences of the night were not limited to the two people most visibly involved. The household that had once been a microcosm of safety began to rearrange itself. Friends took sides, though nobody cared enough to be necessarily just. Secrets replaced conversations, and the air thickened like weather before a storm. No one could say how it would end, but everyone could see the trajectory: a slow unspooling of loyalties, reputations, and the brittle architecture of a family that had once held together. Nicole, composed and resolute, watched the shifts with a clinical eye. She knew the theater of gossip had a short half-life. People tire of feeding on pain when their own lives demand attention. Her task was not to punish but to pivot, and she set about doing that with a pragmatic fury that suited her better than tears would have. She would not be the woman who disappeared after being betrayed. But she also knew that closure required more than movement, it required a final clarity, a separation that was precise and ceremonious. Leslie, left to process Nicole's cool dismissal, had to make a decision. Would she press forward into the role she had carved for herself, provocateur and instigator, or would she pause and question whether this triumph would cost her more than it was worth? The seed of doubt Nicole planted had creaked, and it would either sprout into a campaign of revenge or a defensive retreat. Either choice promised consequences. The story was not over. In fact, for the people involved, it had only just reached the point where their choices would matter the most. The night in the hotel had given them a moment, and now they would live with the aftermath. Each small move, what to answer, what to reveal, which alliances to form, would be a step either toward destruction or toward some rougher, harder form of truth. The danger, for Ted more than anyone, was that he now had to confront whether he could be remade into something stronger, or whether he would remain the man who leaned on others until they tired of holding him. A quiet tension gathered like thunderclouds. The next days would be full of small detonations, conversations that would not be had, confrontations that would be delayed, and the slow administrative violence of divorce that turns intimate history into paper. None of them could say exactly who would emerge intact. But in that moment, in the edge of rupture, one could feel the shape of possibilities, none of them tidy, all of them real. The night had been a fracture. Whether it healed, gaped wider, or scarred into something durable would be decided by choices that had not yet been made.